Morning, it's wonderful to be back, though only through a virtual presence. We talked about this almost 20 years ago, about having meetings where people could come back and forth and not really be in the room. But it's great to be back. I'm going to run through rather quickly a little bit of a story about how we've been engaging over the last year and a half or so at addressing the question of sustainable urbanization within the Sustainable Development Goal frame. So I guess one would start with the idea of the Millennium Development Goals in the late 1990s, the idea that you could do something dramatic for poor people across the world. And the question, of course, is at that point of time, cities were sort of on the radar, but not definitely so, certainly not in the overall global agenda. And cities didn't actually come through the wash as far as the MDGs are concerned. There wasn't an urban MDG, but there was some progress because there was something around slums. And the slum MDG, of course, has been achieved because the targets that were set were very, very limited. So the question, of course, is where does this sit? The MDGs were about goals for poor people in poor countries. Within that, you didn't have anything to deal with regional governments or city governments. There was very little as far as urban employment and urban economic development was concerned. And of course, there was a very limited engagement with urban sustainability and resilience. And finally, the big question that we've been debating for the last decades, of course, is the question of social inclusion, which was not there at all. So in some sense, this was the beginning of a framing, even though Habitat 1 started this whole process in 1976, but it wasn't going very far. So in some ways, over the last 10 or 15 years or so, we've achieved a few things, but not very much. And from this came a realization that something really had to be done, because in the popular consciousness and of course in the policy environment, since 2007 or so, when the world turned, at least demographically, more than half urban, there was an increasing emphasis on addressing this sort of so-called challenge. Of course, what people didn't realize was that in the late 1980s, the world had certainly turned more than half urban as far as national and city and of course the global economy is concerned. So the core question that we were trying to address last year when this whole process started is whether at all there needed to be something done about urban areas within the Sustainable Development Goal framework. At that point of time, cities were absolutely not on the radar. We were way outside the frame of the primary goals, and through a series of sort of fortuitous accidents, we managed to put together a paper early last year in about February 2013 that went through to the high-level panel, which was the political sort of body that was set up by the Secretary General of the UN to try and build a consensus. And because they liked that paper, they commissioned a piece of work which in a sense laid out the sort of theoretical framework and of course the rationale for why we should look at cities. And from that, this became part of an agenda that sort of reached the ears and eyes of the Open Working Group. And of course, over a period of time, starting from, let's say, May last year till about November or so, the key urban institutions in the world, starting with UN Habitat, UCLG, ICLEI, later C40, the SDI network, which works with slum dwellers, and more recently WeGo, started to work together and at least open a dialogue which they hadn't done for maybe 30 or 35 years to actually build a common platform to address this question. So, the rationale that we laid out at that point of time, and this comes from some of the work that I presented to the Open Working Group at the UN General Assembly earlier in the year, was looking at the long-range trends and where cities actually sit within the overall global problematic, within the great opportunities that we have. So if you look at the world in, it's about 110 years ago, in 1900, the population was about 1.5 billion, the gross world product was about 2 trillion, and of course the urban share of the world product was about 30%. And then if you jump to the post-war years, you suddenly see a significant sort of movement. The world population goes up to about 2.5 billion, the gross world product goes to 2.7 trillion, goes up to about 7 trillion, and of course the urban share of that, partially because of the what happened during the war and the post-war boom, the urban share of the world product goes to about 45%. And then, of course, if you jump to almost contemporary, period when the world population touches about 7 billion in 2013, the world product goes up from about 7 trillion to about 70 trillion. This huge, massive expansion in growth that many of us have sort of worked on for 40 years or so. But of course, the important thing in that is that the share of cities in that growth is about 70%. So we're talking about almost $50 trillion of the world product actually coming from cities. So significant drive and push, at least on the economic side and of course on the demographic side, towards cities, and they're becoming quite important, both as sources of employment and output, and hence many of the environmental challenges that we see, including climate change. And then, of course, if you project this further into the mid-2020s, this is from the UN POP division projections as far as population is concerned, you go to about 8 billion people, well over 50%. The world product may sort of be in excess of about 85 trillion, and the urban share goes to 3/4. So essentially, as you've seen here with those black dots, the world shifts from being, partially urban about 100 years ago. So in 100 years, in a century or so, you see a massive explosion of both urban population and of urban economic output. So in any case, over the next 20 or 30 years or so, we cannot ignore, and certainly during the period of the SDGs, that is 2015 to 2030, we have very little opportunity to actually sort of neglect the role of cities, both as places where this challenge emanates from, and of course the tremendous opportunities that sort of taking cities onto a much more sustainable trajectory can actually provide us. So in that sense, urbanization, or the process that we've seen here over the last 100, 115, 20 years or so, is not only just a mega trend, it's actually a, at least in my articulation of it, it's a giga trend. And it's a giga trend because it is a millennium transformation. It's something that we haven't seen since the agricultural revolution about 5,000 years ago. It's a millennium transformation of human culture, of society, of the economy, polity, and of course of the planetary systems that are seriously challenged, and of course feedback into the way that the economy, society, and human culture are actually functioning. So I guess that is the core message that we are dealing with. There's of course massive global changes that we've seen. Cities have a very important role in creating these changes, and of course because of that they have a great role in actually effecting a transition to a much more sustainable world. So like we said earlier, the MDGs didn't really do justice to the idea of urban areas. So the question is, how do we frame something differently in the future? And in some senses, the campaign that we developed starting November last year for a standalone urban sustainable development goal was a reflection of what I would call a 21st century idea whose time has come. This is something that was not tremendously salient, certainly not when the UN was created in the sort of 1950s or the late 1940s, but it's something that's taken on much greater salience just now, and in fact will become one of the more important challenges and opportunities of the next 20 to 50 years. So the framing that we were dealing with, especially from the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, sort of an institutional frame that was built by the UN Secretary General to reach out to other constituents in the world apart from the UN member states, and let's say the NGO community, reaching out to researchers, to academics, and to the private sector. The SDSN actually, over a period of almost a year of fairly intense work, emerged with a set of 10 core goals after a great debate and public review and stuff like that. The idea was to set out goals that were simple, straightforward, and were actionable. So here we have the SDSN proposals for 10 SDGs, which went out sort of late last year in fall 2013. And I've highlighted here 6 and 7. And the reason I've highlighted them in red is because, at least in our articulation at that point of time, and this is very important to the debate in the UN, is that you cannot look at sustainable cities without actually looking at sustainable agriculture and rural prosperity, or dealing with rural poverty. They sort of come back to back. And this was a big challenge, because one of the reasons that the urban goal was not receiving much attention was because a lot of countries in the world today are still agrarian, still making the transition into a different form of development. They're sort of industrializing. They were actually very concerned that if the global framework took on cities as a core goal, rural areas, rural prosperity, and of course sustainable agriculture would be seriously challenged. So this is one thing that we tried to emphasize in the framing, and I think it did receive, it did receive a fairly positive response. But what we found last year in late October, there was a large meeting of UCLG. UCLG basically brings together all the major cities of the world, all the mayors of the world. About, I guess, 1,500 to 2,000 mayors were present in Rabat. And the experience there was very interesting because we had mayors coming forth and saying, look, can you help us talk to our national governments and tell them that, they should devolve resources and capacity, and, they should provide the political space to actually do something, because cities are so important to making sustainability actually happen on the ground. And I turned around and told them, I said, look, that's a wonderful idea, but you're thinking in very 20th century terms, because it is cities, as we've just gone over just now, where this action is happening, where the innovation is happening. And of course, if you look at the structure of the way that both global populations and economic output and employment is actually working, especially past 2008, the real solutions lie with you. So it's a rather, it's a rather unassuming thing for you to say that national governments should reach out and devolve. In actual fact, you have to reach out and grasp and draw what is actually yours. So out of that conversation with a lot of other colleagues across the urban space, emerged a really sort of rapid fire campaign over almost, let's say, we had a period of, I think, 6 to 8 weeks to put it together, which brought together about 200 cities, regional governments, international organizations, people's movements, and universities to support the goal. So we set this up, and partially through social media, through mobilization, by early January, before the Open Working Group opened in New York, I guess on the 6th or 7th of 2014, we were able to pull together a considerable amount of support from a whole range of institutions: UN Habitat, UCLG, Cities Alliance, ICLEIR, the World Urban Campaign, and of course a large number of cities and city organizations from across the world, pretty much across every continent, and of course, a whole range of other institutions that work on urban questions from across the world. Academic institutions, advocacy institutions stepped up and said, look, this is the opportunity for us, because if we don't actually enable this now, we've lost another 15 years. We already, in some senses, lost the first tranche during the MDG process. And of course, the interesting thing was that we were able to mobilize significant people. This is Mayor Eduardo Paes, who now chairs C40, who came out very strongly with Mayor Bloomberg from New York, and sent out a representation to the UN Secretary General, to the chairpersons of the Open Working Group, saying that, look, cities are important, and we support this process, and this is something that we think is going to be very important to move things forward. So the question that we asked was, why use 19th century ideas about development the institutional frames that actually respond to that, to address a 21st century challenge? And in some senses, the articulation is very simple. Urbanization is a global scale process. A sustainable planet depends on how cities grow, function, and respond to the stresses that we create, both endogenous and exogenous. Leaders and citizens of urban areas need to be empowered, and without a goal, you really don't have a way of bring together the community, both inside countries, between countries, and of course at the global level. And of course, the urban SDG would motivate a whole range of partnerships, public-private, community-based partnerships. And of course, the challenge is that, the earlier sort of suggestion was that we take urban issues and mainstream them across everything, across education, across health, across poverty, etc. But there are very significant questions that need to be addressed. And what the urban SDG does is it provides us the opportunity to link health with education, to link that with how public space is used and how safety is dealt with, and with questions of governance, etc. Because this is a site in which much of the changes, and especially the most dramatic changes that we will see over the next 30 or 40 years in Asian and sub-Saharan African cities, this is where, in a sense, as the Secretary General said in one of his addresses in Poland earlier in the year, the battle for sustainable development will be won and fought in its cities, and that, in a sense, was what we were trying to encapsulate. So what we're dealing with now is a new set of 21st century goals that try and balance, and this is somewhat important, not only intergenerational questions, the questions that came to us during WCD and Brundtland, but also intra-generational equity questions. And that is what the challenge of cities in the Global South is all about. And of course, that does imply, and this is a difficult political part, that we need to look at a new governance architecture that balances the interests of the nation state, because the member states of the UN, in a sense, are essentially nation states, and it's challenging for them to be able to agree to a process of devolution which may seem to actually weaken their current position. Of course, what we are arguing in counter to that is that by strengthening local and regional governments, you actually strengthen national governments, because you're able to achieve and try and reach out to the operationalization of sustainability, which cannot be done only at national level. And of course, in very concrete terms, linking up citizens, communities, and of course the private sector, which has become very important in this process as globalization has proceeded, can only functionally happen in some ways at city level. So to lay out a very, very quick articulation of the original Sustainable Development Goal as we laid it out, as we went into this negotiation within the UN Open Working Group process, which you would have heard about a little bit in the last couple of days or so. So the first proposal that we laid out was very simple. The articulation was something like this. It was make all cities socially inclusive, economically productive, environmentally sustainable, secure, and resilient to climate change and other risks. And I think the order of what we laid out is actually quite important, because we believe, and I guess experience from across the world speaks to that question, that social inclusion is probably the most central challenge that we have to deal with. And then, of course, the second part of this was to enable this through changes in governance, to deal with, to use participatory, accountable, and effective city governance to support rapid and equitable urban transformation. So the idea of urban transformation, of using urbanization as a process which will enable this transformation, was introduced fairly sort of early in this game. That's the sort of overall goal. Again, quite complex, because the challenge we're dealing with is actually a wicked problem, multi-scalar, dealing with both present and future generations, a whole range of sort of emergent complex systems kinds of attributes. And then within that, we sort of suggested 3 different targets within the whole framework that the UN is currently working with, starting off with goals and targets, and then setting up indicators, stuff that many of us created, starting with Sustainable Seattle way back in the early 90s. In some senses, we were way ahead, maybe 20 years ahead of the curve in some ways. So the first target was to end extreme urban poverty, expand employment and productivity, and raise living standards, especially in slums. An extension of the MDG process, but putting at the heart of this process, addressing the question of poverty, basically looking at the opportunity of the end of poverty in the next 20 or 30 years, and using the opportunity of sort of balanced regional development, of dealing with sustainable sort of economic development as the driver of that. And then the goal B, which is ensuring universal access to a whole range of basic services, but also well-designed, secure, and affordable built environment, and services like housing, water, sanitation, waste management. And of course now, the bow to what's happening on the climate front, low carbon energy and transportation. And of course, something that did surprise people, including the ITU, who sort of embraced us with open arms, and that is mobile and broadband communication. This, the internet revolution is really enabling large number of people and communities to engage with these questions. And if we sort of build on what we've seen happening since 2008 in so-called Arab Spring and a whole range of other processes, including the recent upheavals in Latin America, access to information flows is probably one of the most important ways in which this dramatic transition can be enabled. And then, of course, a whole range of environmental concerns that we've been dealing with for many years, ensuring safe air and water quality, integrating reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, efficient land and resource use, and of course, resilience to climate and other risks. So this was the frame that we put together, that the campaign and a whole range of other institutions that were tied to this put together. And this is what we proposed to the Open Working Group. And of course, the pitch that we made, and I made this in person over a 2.5-3 hour session in the UN earlier in the year, was to say, look, it is only through an urban goal that we can actually start operationalizing a whole range of these issues, because it is in cities that this happens. And we've actually built a fairly interesting case where we compared, using a multidimensional index, the case of Bangalore and New York. So, to to guide this through very quickly, that's Bangalore, the city that I spend a lot of my time in these days. That's New York City, where we were actually having this debate. And the question then is, how do you actually pick up these targets and operationalize them? So we laid out a framework which picked up 3 targets, 6 indicators each, and looked at over a period of time, starting from the early 1990s, the baseline period for the MDGs, and working out to 2030. Again, you can see a lot of the framing that we've been doing over many years. There's a business as usual scenario in red, and of course a green sort of sustainability scenario there. So you can see interesting things. You can see, for example, in New York, this surprised people, that the workforce participation rate as far as women are concerned is not as dramatically good as you would like it to be, for example. And there are lots of improvements that are there. And of course, in a city like Bangalore, even though it is in a country which is a sort of now low middle income country, there are a whole range of things that need to be done to try and improve the quality of economic development. And then, of course, if you move on to dealing with basic services, you see some interesting trends. Of course, Bangalore is deeply challenged on a whole range of fronts, but just around the question of internet access and access to cell phones, you see a very interesting global convergence between, a great world city like New York, the center, in a sense, at least one point of time, of the world economy, and its convergence in many ways. And then, of course, if you pick up environmental indicators, you see a lot of very interesting challenges. New York obviously deeply challenged, because outside Central Park, at least in Manhattan, there isn't really much opportunity for tree cover. Now, of course, they're trying to do a lot of things in terms of green roofs and a whole range of other things. But Bangalore, in that sense, starting off as a garden city, actually losing a lot of its green cover over the last many years, and then hoping through this process to be able to bounce back. So you see that even across a global scale, 2 megacities in some senses, in very different contexts, in different contexts in terms of economic development, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of wealth, you find an interesting way to try and look at how this process can be operationalized. So we were trying to make the case that if you want to make this happen, you have to devolve, and you have to engage at city level, you have to actually engage at sub-city level in some senses to try and operationalize these processes. But you can build frameworks which allow you to compare across cities and, of course, countries, but you have to create a frame that is not exclusively situated around the nation state. And this, of course, seems very obvious to us, because devolution and subsidiarity has been part of our discussions for 25 years or more, but it's not so obvious in the UN. It's certainly not so obvious to political leaders in countries, and of course to statistical offices who are deeply challenged by having to create a whole set of new indices and sub-indices that work at sub-sovereign level. So there's a deep and interesting fight that's actually working out itself in the next few years or so, to try and see whether we can actually establish this process, we can operationalize it at national and subnational level, and then actually work through a mix of bottom-up and top-down. So after lots of debate, as I said, I was grilled for about 3.5 hours or 2.5 hours by a whole range of countries, and then it went on after that for 6 months. We got something. It did look a little like what we wanted to get. So I would be unfair to say that the Open Working Group didn't actually do a dramatic job, and that's one thing that I said on the floor of the House, that what really struck one was the level of solidarity. And in spite of all the differences that we've seen across countries, in this one debate, at least the debates that I saw, there was a tremendous amount of solidarity. There was a sense that something both needed to be done and could be done, and all the countries of the world would actually work shoulder to shoulder in this. And this is, compared to the other things which are actually quite contentious in the Security Council and other processes, this is something that was very heartening and gives us, I think, a tremendous amount of hope that something can actually change. So instead of the 10 goals that we thought were simple and clear and articulate, we got 17 that came out of a dramatic process. It went literally down to the wire, went over the timeline, actually went to the Saturday when it was meant to close on Friday. But the thing that was very interesting and, in some senses, both a great relief and a cause for celebration, was that cities came up as goal 11. So even if things were crunched as they go forward in the next year and a half or so, for the first time, we have a 21st century goal, in spite of the fact that now climate is being deeply challenged, and there's a big debate happening about climate and ecological resources and ecosystem services, etc. I think we have an articulation, at least at the goal level, that is very close to what we started with. However, the framework itself smacks a lot of Agenda 21. I'm not saying that Agenda 21 was a bad thing, but one of the things that we learned from Rio was, in terms of making things happen, to operationalize processes, it was a great step forward, but it didn't actually lead to very much. We are in many ways not a very different situation from where we were, let's say 23 years ago, 24 years ago. So in some senses, the world cannot afford to let that happen again, and this is one way of trying to address that. So as far as Goal 11 is concerned, we got 7 targets, a little bit confused, a little bit mixed up. Many of the issues that we dealt with are there, but the articulation is probably not what we would actually pick up. So of course, housing is there, basic services and slums are there, access to transportation systems. Transportation actually emerges as a separate target. It was bundled in our framing with a whole range of other things to essentially keep the targets down to 3. Dealing with capacities for participation and sustainable planning. So planning comes up as a number 4, as a number 3 kind of target. And of course, protecting cultural heritage, national heritage comes up, which is an important thing. The question, of course, was or is whether this is something that really can boil itself up in spite of the special interest groups as something that you could take as probably the most important 2 or 3 things if you were dealing with sustainable urbanization. And then, of course, dealing with disaster loss and risk reduction. This is probably one of the few places within the SDG frame in which disaster risk actually appears and climate sort of appears. That partially comes from, I guess, the people in the room and the arguments that we were making. And of course, environmental impact, which we've dealt with quite clearly. And then something that's become, I think, quite important in the last few years or so, providing universal access to safe and inclusive and accessible public spaces, especially for women and children. And then, of course, something that's somewhat confused, 3 sort of means of implementation. This is something in which, I don't necessarily agree with the framing. This is sort of a cop-out in some ways, and this has to be sorted out. The means of implementation are absolutely critical to making this thing happen, and this is sort of very mixed up and has a lot of things inside it, many moving parts which need to be sorted if we have to go down to actually implementation at city level. And I guess the process that we're engaged with just now, with working with cities in many parts of the world to try and figure out how to actually make this thing happen, will give us the feedback to try and rework this framework. So given that, where are we now? We're at a situation where after an intense campaign, we finally have an urban goal. We have targets that we're not so happy with. Many of the issues that we actually worked with are in the targets, but they are mixed up and they do need to be sorted. There are things that are of one order that are mixed with things of another order. They need to be operationalized. And of course, there's a great opportunity because there are a number of other goals that relate to urban goals. For example, you can't have urban sustainability without dealing with urban health or enabling better education, and of course, most centrally, ending poverty in cities. So there's a great opportunity for us not only to clean up and sort out the urban SDG framing as it is, both the level of targets and indicators, because we're not unhappy with what we've got, notionally at least, as far as the goal is concerned. But there's also the opportunity of being able to try and urbanize the other goals. And that's something that we've been working on. We had a major convening about 2 weeks ago where some Balaton members are also present in London to bring the community together and try and see how we can deal with that. And of course, we had people from other areas, from health, from education, from other thematic areas, development areas that were in that discussion. So that's an ongoing process. As far as the campaign is concerned, the whole challenge for us over the next year or so is to make sure that this goes through the UN system most effectively. So in order to make that happen and not get knocked out, because this is a political process, irrespective of what we may say, we have to mobilize. We need to, in a phased manner, widen and deepen the campaign. We need to convene both within and outside to make the linkages to a whole range of other thematic questions, whether it's water or energy or waste or environmental conservation. We need to negotiate with a whole range of member states and other stakeholders. Not everybody is agreed that this is what should go forward. As we go into the General Assembly, there will be a large number of nation states that will sit on the fence. So we have to be able to either bring them on board or make sure that they're sort of neutral. And the naysayers we have to try and sort of bring within the fold. And the more important thing, of course, for us is to help communicate and empower. The story being very simply, cities are part of the future, but they are a future that we have to build ourselves, and they provide a very powerful platform to enable this kind of process to actually change and work itself out. The opportunity is to co-reframe the current paradigm that we're working in, the current sort of development frame that has become standard practice, the canon in some senses. And this has to be done at multiple levels. Obviously at global level, because this is a global discussion, but certainly at national level, and then of course at operational level at cities and with communities. And of course the challenge for us is, if we do get a goal that we are happy with, and one that actually picks up the key targets and indicators we're talking about, the world is going to expect us to start being able to deliver in 2016. So being able to mobilize the community across as many countries and as many cities as we can to prepare to start delivery, because, as I said, we have to thread through this eye of the thread, sort of sustainability through the eye of the needle in maybe 15 or 20 years. That isn't actually a tremendous amount of time if you look at the dynamics of development and of sustainability. And then, of course, the key thing to make that happen, to really make this happen across tens of thousands of places and involving, let's say, tens of millions of people, if not hundreds of millions of people, is to actually reach out to educate both ourselves as an urban community and, of course, the world. And that's where Balaton and a whole range of other partnerships across the world are going to be very important. It isn't the education that we can actually scale this message. We can take it out, and the innovation can actually happen at the place. So, of course, for those of you who haven't seen many of us struggle with this over the last 25 years or so, the key question is, how did I get into all of this? We're doing a lot of stuff on systems and on cities and stuff like that. How did one get involved in this sort of global play? And I think the answer is very simple. It goes back to a small meeting. I think there were 6 or 7 of us on the second floor, if I remember correctly, of Hotel Petrol on Balaton. This is an earlier incarnation. It was 1998, if I remember correctly. And Alan and Joan and Hartmut and Dana and a few of us were in the room. And this is what came out. So this is one of what I consider Dana's most important pieces of writing. It's a short piece that looks at places to intervene in the system, and it lays out in descending order or in increasing order of effectiveness things or processes by which we can actually effect dramatic transformatory change. And what, in a sense, has been powering a lot of us, certainly me, is the ability to actually use these systems heuristics to try and catalyze and enable transformatory change. And of course, third from the top is changing the goals in the system. So it's obvious in some senses, after being part of the discussion, after sort of participating in that tremendously inductive moment when these emerged and were written out on the board, literally in 5 minutes, that changing the goals of the system is one of the most effective ways to actually effect dramatic change. Most of us spend much of our lives in dealing with, items 12, 10, 11, etc. The underlying processes that drive systems. And of course, many of us, and I guess most of us, hope that some of our work may actually enable the really dramatic change, the changes of paradigm and mindset from which the system arises. And of course, what Dana and some of us have tried to do in our work, and that is the power to be able to transcend paradigms. And that, of course, is the power to actually change the world. So wonderful to see all of you again, and I hope I'm able to come back in person not too far in the future.